The morning I collapsed in the break room, I had been awake for 31 hours straight. That's not a dramatic exaggeration. I know the exact number because I've been tracking my hours for a performance review that was supposed to happen the following Thursday. I remember sitting on the linoleum floor after my knees gave out, staring up at the fluorescent light on the ceiling, thinking, I need to email Hendrix before I pass out. That was my actual thought. Not call someone, not I need help. Email Hendrix. My coworker found me. She said my name twice before she started yelling for someone to call 911. I don't remember that part. I remember the floor being cold, and then I remember a different kind of cold. The kind that comes with an IV line and a blood pressure cuff inflating around my arm every 15 minutes through the night. My name is Alison. I'm 31 years old. At the time this happened, I was a compliance analyst at a mid-sized logistics firm in Columbus, Ohio. I had a studio apartment I barely slept in, a savings account I barely touched, and a family 60 miles away in Dayton that I sent money to every single month like clockwork. I want to tell you that story. Not the collapse, although that's part of it. I want to tell you about what happened while I was lying in that hospital bed, and what I found out when I finally got home. I grew up the oldest of 3. My brother is 4 years younger than me, my sister 8. My parents always told people I was the responsible one, which is a nice way of saying I was the one who never caused problems, which is a nicer way of saying I was the one they didn't have to think about. My brother is what my mother calls spirited. What she means is that he spent the better part of his adult life making decisions that require other people to clean up after him. 2 DUIs before 30. A business he started with $14,000 of my parents' money that lasted 7 months. An ex-girlfriend who took him to small claims court. He is charming and funny, and everyone in my family loves him in this helpless, exhausted way, the way you love something you can't fix. My sister is the youngest, and she learned early that being the youngest and the prettiest meant she didn't have to work particularly hard for anything. She's not mean. She's not calculating. She's just accustomed to things being provided, accustomed to someone else handling it. That someone else was usually me. It started small, the way these things always do. After I got my first real job at 23, my mother called and said my dad's truck needed a repair and could I help out just this once. $600. I sent it. Then it was the water bill. They'd fallen behind. Then it was my brother needing first and last month's rent on an apartment because his credit score was, in his words, going through something. Then it was my sister's car insurance. Then my mother's dental work. Then my father's back brace that insurance wouldn't cover. I kept a spreadsheet for a while. I stopped keeping it when the number got embarrassing. At my peak, I was sending home between $1,200 and $1,800 and $1,800 a month. I was making $67,000 a year. You can do that math. I was living on the rest, which meant I was essentially functioning as a full-time employee of my own family, while also holding down an actual full-time job. I told myself it was temporary. That's what you tell yourself. I told myself my parents would get stable. My brother would figure it out. My sister would grow up. I kept extending the timeline. A year became 2, became 5. By the time I collapsed on that break room floor, I had been sending money home for 7 years. What I hadn't been doing was sleeping, or eating real meals, or seeing a doctor for the headaches that had been getting worse since the previous fall. My blood pressure at the ER was high enough that the intake nurse said, "Oh, honey," before she caught herself and switched back to clinical language. The diagnosis was hypertensive crisis brought on by chronic stress and exhaustion. They admitted me to the cardiac unit for observation, not the ICU, I want to be accurate, but a monitored bed with leads on my chest and a nurse checking on me every hour. My mother arrived at the hospital around noon the next day. I know this because I was awake, and I watched the door, and I felt something loosen in my chest when I heard her voice in the hallway. My dad came in first. He looked scared. He held my hand and didn't say anything for a minute, and that was the most comfort I'd felt in a long time. My mother came in behind him, kissed my forehead, and then stood at the foot of the bed and said, "The doctors say you're stable." I said yes, she said. Stable like going home soon, or stable like still serious. I said I didn't know yet. They wanted to monitor me for at least another day or two. She looked at my dad. He looked at the window. She said, "The thing is, we have the Hartley wedding this weekend." I didn't say anything. I thought I'd misheard her. She kept going. My cousin, my dad's nephew, was getting married in Charleston, South Carolina that Saturday. They'd booked flights months ago, non-refundable. My sister was in the wedding party. My brother had already driven down the day before. The whole family was going to be there. It was a big deal. My cousin had specifically asked that all the family come. I said, "I'm in the hospital." She said she knew that. She said it wasn't like they wanted to leave, but I was stable. The doctor said stable, and there was nothing they could do here, really, just sit in a chair. And didn't I think my dad said her name once, quietly. She stopped. But the damage was already done. I knew what the rest of the sentence was. They left the next morning. Both of them. My mother hugged me before she went and told me to rest and that she'd called to check in. My dad stood in the doorway for a long moment. He looked like he was going to say something. Then my mother called his name from the hallway, and he squeezed my hand once and walked out. I lay in that bed alone for 3 more days. My coworker, the one who found me, her name is Sandra, came by on day 2 with a burrito bowl and a trashy magazine and sat with me for 2 hours. She didn't make a big deal of it. She just showed up. I cried in the bathroom after she left, which I'm telling you because it's true and because it matters. No one from my family called until the wedding was over. My mother texted once, "How are you feeling, honey?" No question mark. I didn't respond. My brother sent a voice memo that was mostly background noise from what sounded like a reception and him saying, "Hey, heard you were in the hospital. Hope you're good. Love you." 12 seconds. My sister didn't contact me at all until the following Tuesday, which was 4 days after I'd been discharged, and her message was, "Mom said you're home. Feeling better? Also, can you cover my car payment this month? Things have been tight." I sat with my phone in my hand for a very long time. I didn't respond to that one either. Here's the part I haven't told many people. On my 3rd night in the hospital, the night before I was discharged, a nurse came in to do my midnight check and mentioned, almost casually, that I'd had a visitor earlier that evening. She seemed to think I knew. She said something like, "Your gentleman visitor signed out around 9. Did he come back by?" I said, "What visitor?" She got a little flustered. She said a man had been there. He'd shown up at the nurse's station asking after me. She said he'd sat in the family waiting area for about an hour. She assumed he was a relative. I told her I had no idea who that was. My family was out of town. She went to check the visitor log. When she brought it back, I saw a name I didn't recognize. The log required full names, time in, time out, relationship to patient. Under relationship, it said family friend. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, the kind you don't see much anymore. The name was Theodore Marsh. I didn't know anyone named Theodore Marsh. I thought about it all the way through my discharge the next morning. I thought about it on the drive home. Sandra picked me up. I thought about it while I was unpacking my bag and finding the outfit I'd been wearing when I collapsed, still folded in the bottom. Thought about it while I made soup from a can and sat on my couch under a blanket and tried to feel like a person again. Theodore Marsh. I Googled the name. There were several. Too many to narrow down without more information. I let it sit for almost a week. I had other things to deal with. Work recovery, the very deliberate process of not responding to my sister's car payment request. Then my mother called. She wanted to tell me about the wedding. She went on for a while. The flowers, my cousin's dress, the dinner. She asked how I was feeling. I said fine. She said good. Good in the way she does when she's about to get to the real reason she called. The real reason was that my brother was behind on rent again. Could I said no. Silence. She said, "What?" I said no. Silence. She said, "What?" I said, "No, I can't help with that right now." She said she didn't understand. I was working, wasn't I? I'd been sending money every month. What had changed? I said I was in hospital. I almost had a stroke. I'm 31 years old, and I almost had a stroke because I had been under unrelenting financial and emotional pressure for 7 years. So no. Right now, the answer is no. She got quiet in a different way. Not surprised quiet. Something else. She said, "After everything we've done for you." I had heard that phrase my whole life. I had always let it land and settle and eventually take root the way it was supposed to, as guilt, as obligation, as proof that I owed a debt I could never fully repay. This time it landed differently. This time I just felt tired. I said, "I need to go." I hung up, and then I sat there thinking about Theodore Marsh. I found him 3 weeks later. It was my aunt, my mother's younger sister, Pauline, the one who moved to Portland years ago and maintained a careful distance from the rest of the family. I'd always liked her. She sent me a card when I got my first job. She was the only one who called on my actual birthday, not the day before or after. I called her under the pretense of thanking her for the card she'd sent after she heard about the hospital. We talked for a while. At some point I said carefully that someone named Theodore Marsh had come to visit me at the hospital and I couldn't figure out who he was. Pauline went quiet, not the usual quiet, a different kind, the kind that comes before something you've been carrying for a long time. I said her name. She said, "How did you?" I said I'd seen the visitor log. She breathed out slowly. Then she said, "I think this is a conversation you need to have with your mother." I said, "Pauline, I just hung up on my mother for the first time in my life. I am not calling her back to ask about this man. I'm asking you." Long pause. She said, "Alison, Ted Marsh is. He's someone your mother knew before she met your dad." I waited. She said, "He's your biological father." I want to be careful here about how I describe what happened inside me when she said that, because I've seen enough of these kinds of stories go sideways into melodrama, and that's not what it felt like. It didn't feel like a bomb going off. It felt like something I'd already half known settling into a shape I could finally look at directly. I'm adopted. Not officially. My dad, the man who raised me, is on my birth certificate. But Pauline told me that my mother and Ted Marsh had been together for almost 2 years before the relationship ended. She got pregnant. She didn't tell him. She met my dad shortly after. They married quickly, and my mother made a decision that I don't think she ever fully reckoned with. She let another man raise her daughter and never said a word. Pauline didn't know all the details. She knew that Ted had figured it out, eventually, that he had reached out to my mother years ago and she had refused contact, that he had, from a distance, tried to keep track of me, graduations, things like that. She said she thought he might have been at my college graduation, that she'd seen someone in the crowd she didn't recognize who had stayed to watch and then left without speaking to anyone. I was 22 at my college graduation. That was 9 years ago. 9 years of this man watching from a distance because my mother had made a choice for both of us without consulting either one. I got Ted Marsh's contact information from Pauline. I sat on it for 2 more weeks. I made a therapy appointment, my first ever, and I talked it through before I did anything. Then I called him. He picked up on the second ring. When I said my name, he didn't say anything for a moment. And then he said, "Alison, I wondered when this day would come." His voice was calm, steady. He didn't make it dramatic. He didn't cry or fall apart or overcorrect into excessive warmth. He just talked to me like I was a person he had hoped to speak to for a very long time. We talked for almost 2 hours that first call. He lives in Cincinnati, 45 minutes from Columbus. He's an engineer, retired now. He has a wife, Patricia. Wait, no, I'm not allowed to use that name. He has a wife. 2 sons, my half-brothers. He said that his wife knew about me, had always known, and had supported him in trying to make contact over the years. He didn't ask me for anything. That's the thing I keep coming back to. He called the hospital that night because Pauline had told him what happened, and he needed to know I was okay. He sat in the waiting room for an hour because he didn't feel he had the right to walk into my room unannounced. He signed a visitor log and then he left. He said, "I didn't want to ambush you, I just needed to know you were all right." I did eventually talk to my mother, not for another month and not the conversation she expected. I told her I knew. I told her I'd spoken to Pauline and I'd spoken to Ted. I told her that I was not calling to fight. I was calling because I wanted her to know that I knew and that I had made a decision. She cried. She explained. She said she'd been young, she'd been scared, she'd convinced herself she was protecting me by keeping the family intact, She said she'd always meant to tell me when the time was right. I said, I'm 31. I had a hypertensive crisis at 31 because I have spent my entire adult life trying to hold this family together financially and emotionally, and the whole time there was someone out there who actually wanted to be in my life, and you kept him out. When exactly was the right time? She didn't have an answer for that. I told her that I was taking a break from financial support, indefinitely, that I was in therapy, that I would not be available for money requests from her, my brother, or my sister for the foreseeable future. I said it clearly, without anger, which took a lot of practice. She said, So that's it? You're just done with us? I said, I'm not done with you. I'm done with the version of this relationship where I exist to support everyone else while nobody shows up for me. If you want a different kind of relationship, I'm open to that. But the other kind is over. She hung up. That's okay. My brother did eventually get a new job and pay his own rent. I found this out from my aunt. I don't think he needed me as much as everyone believed. I think when the option to call Alison existed, he called. When it didn't, he figured it out. My sister got a roommate and started contributing to her own car insurance. Same principle. My parents are still together. My dad texted me in November to say he was sorry he had left the hospital that day. It was the most direct apology I have ever received from a man who is not good at apologies, and I read it about 10 times. I wrote back and said, Thank you, and that I wasn't ready to talk yet, but I appreciated him saying it. I had dinner with Ted and his wife in December. She made pot roast, and his youngest son, my half-brother, came home from college for the weekend and sat across from me at the dinner table and looked exactly like me around the eyes. He didn't know how to act. Neither did I. We both pretended to be more interested in the breadbasket than we were. It was the most normal, awkward, lovely family dinner I have ever had. I slept for 9 hours that night. I don't remember the last time I slept 9 hours before that. I still live in Columbus. I still work in compliance, though I took 6 weeks of medical leave last spring and came back to a negotiated schedule. 4 days a week, hard stop at 6. My blood pressure is normal now. My therapist says I have made, and I'm quoting her directly, remarkable progress for someone who had never given herself permission to exist as a separate person from her family of origin. I wrote that down and put it on my refrigerator. Sandra and I have lunch most Fridays. She still doesn't know the full story. She knows the version where I was in the hospital and my family left town, and she has very strong opinions about that, and I love her for it. Ted and I talk on the phone every couple of weeks. It's not the relationship you see in movies. We're not making up for lost time with grand gestures. There's no tearful montage. It's just two people getting to know each other slowly, which is what we are. I told him about my job. He told me about the hiking trail he's been doing every Saturday morning. We're both figuring out what this is. I think that's enough. I think that's actually more than enough. For 7 years, I sent money home every month like I was paying down a debt I couldn't name. I ran myself into the ground trying to be the person everyone needed me to be, and I almost paid for it with my health and probably years off my life. And the whole time, somewhere in Cincinnati, a man was quietly checking in on me from a distance, keeping my photo in his wallet, sitting in hospital waiting rooms at 9 o'clock at night, just to know I was okay. He didn't come in and rescue me. He couldn't. But he showed up. In the one moment when nobody else did, he showed up. I think about that a lot. I think about what it means to actually show up for someone, not because you expect something in return, not because you'll feel guilty if you don't, but because you genuinely, simply want them to be all right. I want to be that person for myself now. I think I'm getting there. I used to think that loyalty meant never saying no, that if I loved my family enough, gave enough, sacrificed enough, eventually the scale would balance out. Eventually they would show up for me the way I had always shown up for them. I genuinely believed that. For 7 years I believed it with everything I had. What I know now is that people show you who they are not in the easy moments, but in the ones that cost them something. My mother knew I was lying in a hospital bed with a blood pressure reading that scared the nursing staff, and she still weighed that against non-refundable flight tickets, and chose the tickets. That was information. It hurt to receive it, but it was real, and it was true, and I think some part of me needed to see it that clearly before I could stop explaining it away. The hardest thing about being the responsible one in a family is that your reliability becomes invisible. Nobody thinks about where the money comes from because it always comes. Nobody worries about whether you're okay because you're always okay. You train the people around you to need you without seeing you, and then you wonder why you feel so alone in a room full of people who call themselves your family. I did that. I participated in that dynamic for years, and I'm not letting myself off the hook for it. The day I started sending money home without a conversation, without a plan, without a boundary, that was the day I made a choice too. What changed me wasn't the hospital. It wasn't even finding out about Ted. It was the visitor log. This man, someone I had never met, someone my mother had spent decades keeping out of my life, drove to Columbus on a Tuesday night, sat in a waiting room for an hour, signed his name in careful handwriting, and left without asking for anything. He didn't know if I would ever call him. He came anyway. That is what it looks like when someone genuinely cares about you. Not the people who say they love you while boarding a plane. The person who shows up quietly with no audience, no expectation, no guarantee that it will ever be acknowledged. I spent a long time being angry. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't. But I've learned that anger, when you actually sit with it instead of performing it, eventually tells you something useful. Mine told me that I had spent my whole adult life waiting for permission to matter, from my mother, from my family, from everyone except myself. And nobody was going to give me that permission. I had to take it. The courage it took to say no to my mother that first time, to say I was in the hospital and you left out loud without softening it. That was the hardest thing I've ever done. Harder than any performance review, harder than any all-nighter, harder than the whole hospital stay. Because saying it meant accepting that the relationship I had been trying to protect didn't exist in the form I had imagined it. But here's what I also know. Ted and I talked on the phone last Sunday for 40 minutes about nothing important. He told me about a trail he found. I told him about a restaurant Sandra and I tried. It was completely ordinary. I hung up and realized my shoulders had been down the whole time. That is what it feels like when the weight is actually gone. Not dramatic, just quiet and real.